This fear didn't belong to her. She stumbled out of bed and towards the mirror in her bathroom. She flipped on the light, the bright glare making her squint. She stared at her reflection. Still the brown hair, the green eyes, the freckles on her nose, but something had changed. Her eyes, they were wide, filled with a fear she had never known. The cold confidence she had felt a few hours ago was completely gone, replaced by the vulnerability and confusion of a traumatized child. The exchange was no longer a subtle process. It had become an invasion. Alex's memory was not just being copied into her mind. It was beginning to overwrite her very being. The next day at school, the change was obvious. She was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of focus. It was the silence of fear. She jumped at every sound, avoided eye contact with others. When Alex found her in the library, he almost didn't recognize her. "Emily?" he called, his voice hesitant. She looked up, and when she saw him, a flicker of relief appeared in her frightened eyes. "Alex," she whispered. They sat across from each other, the reversal nearly complete. Alex, having reclaimed his memories, looked calmer, more focused, though still tired. Emily, having experienced that memory, was a mess of anxiety and fear. "I dreamed it," she said, her voice trembling. "Your dream." "I was there." Alex nodded, his face grim. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" "The exchange." "It's not just an exchange anymore," Emily replied, her eyes darting nervously around the library. "It's like an erasure. I'm feeling what you felt. I'm losing myself." They realized they couldn't solve this by trying to seal the room. Doing so would be like closing a door while the house was on fire. The room wasn't the source of the problem. It was just a gateway. To stop this, they had to understand where it came from. "Finch's experiment," Alex said, his voice low. "It can't just be a failed psychological therapy. There has to be something else, something older." A faint spark of determination flickered in Emily's fearful eyes. "We need to find out," she said. "We need to find older records. Anything about psychological reversal. Anything about the history of this school, about that room itself." It was their only hope. Not to go back to who they were. They feared that was already impossible. But to stop themselves from completely disappearing into each other, consumed by the other's memories and pain. The Millfield High School library was a sanctuary for Alex, a kingdom of silence and order, but today, it felt like a prison. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the air, creating hazy columns of light between the towering bookshelves. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and desperation. They had spent hours there, poring over old yearbooks, yellowed school newspapers, and boring administrative files. Emily, still haunted by the fear from Alex's memory, worked mechanically. Her eyes scanned the pages without really seeing anything, her mind still trapped in last night's terrifying dream. Every time a book dropped or another student coughed, she would jump, her eyes wide with panic. Alex, on the other hand, worked with an almost frantic concentration, the weight of guilt and responsibility pressed down on him. He was the one who had started all this. However, unintentionally now, he felt he had to be the one to end it. Searched for anything with Principal Finch's name, any notes about experimental programs or psychological counseling from his early years in office, but it was all for naught. It seemed every official record of that experiment had been wiped clean. They were both exhausted, their eyes red from lack of sleep and stress. Their hope was dwindling, replaced by a cold sense of helplessness. "Maybe there's nothing here," Emily whispered, Her voice barely audible, she buried her head in her arms on the table, her brown hair hiding her face. Maybe we're just fooling ourselves. Alex looked at her, a pang of pain rising in his chest. He wanted to comfort her, to say that everything would be okay. But the words felt hollow. He knew that things were not okay. He was seeing his own childhood fear manifest in his best friend. And it was an unbearable sight. "Not yet," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "We haven't looked everywhere." He stood up, looking around the library. "The public stuff has nothing. We need to find the things that have been forgotten." His gaze fell on a low, unmarked door in the far corner of the library. It was the door to the basement archives, a place students were rarely allowed to enter without a word. They walked towards it. The door was unlocked. They stepped inside, and a blast of damp, musty air hit them in the face. A creaky wooden staircase led down to a dimly lit room, cluttered with stacks of old cardboard boxes and rusted metal filing cabinets. This was where the school's old documents were brought to be forgotten. They began to search, the faint light from the single bare bulb overhead casting strange shadows on the walls. Hours passed. Dust settled on their clothes, and in their hair desperation began to set in again. And then, in an unlocked filing cabinet in the corner, Alex found it. It wasn't an official file, but a small, unlabeled wooden box. Inside was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting inside was a woman's, written in faded ink. "Emily," Alex called, his voice hoarse. They sat on the dusty floor, carefully turning the pages of the journal. This was not Principal Finch's diary. It was much older, from the 1950s. It belonged to someone named Eleanor Vance, the school's first psychologist. The first few pages recorded ordinary observations about students, but as they read on, the content became stranger. Eleanor was not just a psychologist, she was also a researcher of fringe psychological theories, ideas that were rejected by the mainstream scientific community. And then they found the term psychological inversion. According to Eleanor, it was an ancient theory of empathic transference. She believed that deep psychological traumas could be transferred from one person to another through a process of resonance, using focusing objects like a specially treated mirror and geometric symbols, like a spiral, to amplify and direct psychic energy. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her face pale. "This isn't science. This is magic." The journal described an experiment Eleanor had conducted herself. She had tried to transfer the fear of a traumatized student to another, stronger, volunteer student. The result was a disaster. The inversion was successful, but in a horrific way, Eleanor wrote, her handwriting trembling. They did not just exchange emotions. They began to exchange memories, habits, fragments of self. The volunteer boy began to have the other's nightmares. The traumatized boy became cold and distant. They were not healed. They were being erased, dissolved into each other. "I have created a two-headed monster. I must stop it." A feeling of hope mixed with despair washed over Emily and Alex. Finally, they understood the nature of what was happening to them. Finch didn't invent this. He had just found and foolishly replicated ancient and dangerous ritual. He didn't understand, but with understanding came a deeper horror. Eleanor described the process as nearly irreversible. However, in the final pages, there was a faint glimmer of hope. The inversion is created by a symbol. Perhaps it can be sealed by a counter symbol. A breaking of the loop, a seal, but the risk is immense. Attempting to seal it could accelerate the dissolution instead of stopping it. Next to the text was a drawing, a spiral symbol, similar to the one on the wall. but with a straight line drawn through its center. They looked at each other, their tired eyes now shining with a desperate resolve. They knew what they had to do. The plan was insane, based on the notes of a woman from 70 years ago about a discredited theory, but it was all they had. They would go back to that room one more time. And this time, they would try to seal it asterisk. They didn't go back to class. After carefully placing Eleanor Vance's journal back in the wooden box and hiding it in its original spot, they left the dusty basement archives like two ghosts. The library was closed, and they had to sneak out through an unlocked window in the gym. The chilly evening air hit them, but it couldn't compare to the bone-deep cold they felt inside. The decision had been made in the heavy silence of the basement. They didn't need to discuss it. They both knew they couldn't wait. With every passing hour, the boundary between them grew fainter. "We need something to draw with," Alex said, his voice resolute. Emily's panicked fear seemed to have transferred a strange focus to him. "Chalk. The art room is on the second floor." Their third trip into the school at night had a completely different feel. Gone was the naive curiosity or the vague furno. Every step they took was heavy with desperate purpose. The school was no longer an inanimate building. It felt like a living creature watching them. The dark hallways like the throat of a monster, and its silence, the calm before a storm. They easily got a box of white chalk from the art room. Then they headed towards that familiar hallway. As they got closer, the temperature dropped noticeably. Asterisk. The air became thick, still, as if space itself was holding its breath. The door to the room was closed and silent. Alex reached for the doorknob, and this time, he didn't feel the strange warmth. Instead, it was bitingly cold, like touching a block of ice. He opened the door. Inside, the darkness was even thicker than before. The light from their flashlights seemed to be swallowed by the dark, only able to illuminate a small, dim circle. Asterisk. The spiral on the opposite wall seemed to vibrate slightly, an optical illusion caused by their extreme stress. "Give me the chalk," Emily said. Her voice was still trembling, but a cold determination glinted in her eyes. She was the one who had experienced Alex's fear most directly. She had the greatest motivation to end it. Alex handed her a piece of white chalk. Emily took a deep breath, trying to keep her hand from shaking, and walked towards the wall. As she raised her hand, a low humming sound began to fill the room, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. Their flashlight beams began to flicker. "Hurry, Emily," Alex urged, his voice tense. Emily pressed the chalk against the wall. Right in the center of the spiral, she began to draw a straight line, bisecting its center, just like the drawing in Eleanor's journal. As soon as the chalk touched the wall, the humming grew louder. A blast of icy wind swept through the room, making their hair stand on end. The spiral seemed to resist, its black paint darkening, trying to push back the white chalk mark. Emily gritted her teeth, using all her strength to finish the line. And then, as the line was completed, everything suddenly stopped. The humming ceased. The wind vanished. The flashlight beams stabilized. Silence fell, but it wasn't the suffocating silence from before. It was empty, normal. The oppressive feeling in the room had dissipated. The air warmed up slightly. Looked at each other, gasping for breath, not daring to believe what had just happened. It worked, Emily whispered, her voice full of amazement. She stepped back from the wall, the chalk falling from her numb fingers. They felt the change immediately. The overwhelming fear that had clung to Emily all day began to fade. Like morning mist, she still felt anxious, but it was her own anxiety, not a borrowed terror. Alex, on the other hand, felt a familiar fog returning to his mind. Emily's characteristic absent-mindedness, The reversal process had stopped. An overwhelming sense of relief washed over them. They had done it. They had faced the impossible, and when they hurried out of the room, slamming the door behind them, and ran out of the school as fast as they could, without looking back on the way home, under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. The silence between them was initially one of liberation, but gradually, it transformed into something else as Alex's fear faded. Another feeling began to rise in Emily, a cold clarity. She was no longer paralyzed by someone else's emotions, and her mind began to analyze. She glanced at Alex walking beside her. He was the one who had participated in the original experiment. He was the one who had inadvertently dragged her into this Eleanor's journal said the experiment was to transfer trauma. A terrifying, toxic thought began to form in her mind. Had Alex unconsciously chosen her? Had some part of him sought someone to unload his childhood burden onto? His confession, his vulnerability. Was it all just a subtle manipulation to make her accept his memories? Paranoia began to take root. It didn't make sense, but in her fragile mental state, it seemed perfectly plausible. She felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. She wanted to reach out and take his hand, to seek comfort after the nightmare they had just endured, but instead, she kept a small distance between them. Alex, still basking in relief, didn't notice the subtle shift. "We did it," he said, a tired smile on his face. "Yeah," Emily replied, but her voice had lost its warmth. "We did it." When they reached the corner, they parted with a brief note. A new, unspoken tension hung in the air between them. The threat from the room seemed to have been neutralized, but a new threat, a crack from within, had just been born that night. Emily stood in front of the mirror in her bathroom. She no longer saw Alex's fear in her eyes. Instead, she saw something else. A cold, sharp suspicion, and for the first time in days, she wasn't sure if the reflection was truly her own. The relief lasted only a day. It was a false peace, as fragile as a thin layer of ice on a lake at the start of winter on the surface. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. Emily was no longer haunted by Alex's fear. Alex no longer felt Emily's cold focus. They were back to being themselves, more or less, but beneath the surface, something had been permanently fractured, like a re-glued ceramic vase. The cracks were still visible, a constant reminder of the breakage for Emily. The silence in her mind was terrifying. When Alex's fear disappeared, it left a void. And that void was quickly filled by something even more toxic. Suspicion, the seed of paranoia, planted the night before, had taken root and grown at an alarming rate in the fertile ground of a tired and traumatized mind. She couldn't look at Alex the same way anymore. Every past act of kindness, every word of concern, was now viewed through a new, distorted lens. When he helped her find her lost papers, did he see an opportunity? When he agreed to go back to the school, was an unconscious part of him leading her to that room? Her reason screamed that it was absurd. Alex was her friend. He had suffered too. But her emotions, now freed from the forced empathy, told a different story. It was a story of survival, of a traumatized mind seeking to unload its burden onto someone else. The rain started in the afternoon. Just a light drizzle at first, but it grew heavier as night fell. The steady drumming of rain on the roof sounded like a drumbeat, heralding an inevitable confrontation. Emily couldn't take it anymore. She had to confront him. She put on her jacket, didn't bother with an umbrella, and walked across the wet lawn that separated their houses. The light from Alex's living room window cast a pale, yellow slash across the rain-swept darkness. She knocked on the door, her knuckles cold. Alex opened the door, and a relieved smile crossed his face when he saw her. "Emily, I was just about to text you. Come in, you're soaking wet." But his smile faded when he saw her expression. Emily didn't step inside. She stood on the porch, rainwater streaming from her hair, her face hard and cold in the porch light. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice frighteningly flat. A chill ran down Alex's spine, having nothing to do with the cold wind. "Okay," he said, stepping outside with her. "What's wrong?" "That experiment," Emily began, getting straight to the point. "Eleanor's journal. She said it was to transfer trauma." "Yeah," Alex nodded, confused. "And it failed. It almost destroyed us." "Did it really fail?" Emily asked, her eyes locked on his, glistening in the faint light. "Or did it succeed? Just not in the way we thought. Your burden, your fear, I felt it all. It's gone now, isn't it?" Alex was stunned. It took him a moment to grasp the implication of her words. "Emily, what are you saying? You don't think I did that on purpose, do you?" "I don't know if you did it on purpose," she replied, her voice sharp as a knife. "But it happened. You were in that experiment years ago. You knew about the room. You were the one who dragged me into this. And in the end, I was the one who carried your pain." Every word was like a punch to Alex's chest. Disbelief and hurt were plain on his face. "No, that's not how it was. I would never. You're my friend." "Your friend?" Emily scoffed, a bitter sound. "Or was I just a convenient solution? Someone forgetful enough, gullible enough, for you to unload your demons onto? Stop it." Alex shouted, his voice breaking. He took a step back. As if her words could actually cause physical harm, he started to tremble, and not just from the cold. "How can you think that after everything we've been through? We did it together. We saved each other." "You saved yourself, Alex," Emily said, her voice as cold as ice. "And you used me to do it." The rain was now pouring down, washing away any warmth that remained between them under the extreme stress. Subtle changes began to reappear. Emily, the accuser, became frighteningly quiet and cold, just like the old Alex, trying to defend himself. Began to stutter, his thoughts becoming jumbled, just like Emily's familiar absent-mindedness. I didn't. It wasn't." He stammered, trying to find the words to express the betrayal he felt, but Emily was no longer listening. Her trust had been shattered in her eyes. His panic was not a sign of innocence, but an admission of guilt. "I think you should stay away from me," she said, her voice finally showing a slight tremor. She turned her back, walking into the pouring rain, leaving Alex standing alone on the porch. Drenched and heartbroken, the monster in the room may have been sealed, but it had left another monster in its place, a monster born of fear and suspicion. And it had just torn their friendship apart. The rain had stopped by morning, but it left behind a gray, damp, and cold world. The sky was the color of slate, and puddles on the sidewalk reflected a bleak scene. The town of Millfield seemed to be holding its breath, shrouded in a post-storm gloom. A perfect reflection of the devastation in Two Souls for Emily. The silence after the confrontation brought a terrifying emptiness. The paranoia was no longer a burning emotion. It had cooled and solidified into a cold, unshakable truth in her mind. Alex had used her. Trust, already fragile after what they had been through, was now completely shattered. The following days at school were a silent torture. Emily built invisible walls around herself. She went to class, took notes mechanically, and left as soon as the bell rang. She became completely quiet. Not Alex's hesitant quietness, but a sharp, cold silence. A warning to anyone who dared to get close. Her friends noticed it immediately. Jessica, her best friend, tried to approach her at lunch. What's wrong?" Are you okay? You look. I'm fine. Emily cut her off, her voice flat. Emotionless, she didn't look up from her food tray. But you've barely said a word in 2 days. Jessica persisted. And Alex looks terrible too. Did you two have a fight?